Cool. Okay. Some reminders before I start my TypeScript lecture. We have a virtual hackathon tomorrow on Gather. It's from 7 p.m. Eastern time to 1, not 1 p.m. That's a typo, 1 a.m. It is a 6-hour hackathon. I'll change the slides accordingly. And this will be your last chance to get like live help from us before milestone 2 is due, which is due this coming Tuesday. I won't repeat that for all of y'all who may have not been listening, but it is due this coming Tuesday. That's in like 4 days. And that is basically your minimal viable product. You should go to this link to see more about it. So I'm going to read it to you here. So for this milestone, you will need a login system. So you need to implement auth, which I think we have kind of done for you in the skeleton code. You need to have dynamic content already. Like you have to have some functional version of your like website working. You need to hook it up with your database. And you also need, your killer feature implemented. So we need to be able to see exactly like what your website does from that. Like it doesn't have to work well and it doesn't have to look pretty, but it needs to work somewhat is the requirement. And it needs to be deployed as well. And that will be tomorrow. So you'll answer these following questions in the Google form that we will release sometime tonight or tomorrow. So this submit here doesn't work yet, but it'll be up by the end of the weekend. And yeah, I've attached this link here. You should bookmark this because it also includes the things you'll need for your final submission. But it's due this coming Tuesday. So if this is you, what is milestone 2? Is it the MVP? Yes, totally forgot about that. Have no fear. We can help you out at the virtual hackathon, provided you've been to most of our lectures and kind of know what's going on. But yes. Also, you should read the pinned Piazza posts. They are there for a reason. We get a lot of duplicate questions about where things are, but they're all in the post right above you. So let's go to Piazza together. Things you can see. Johan has released the TypeScript skeleton. Nick has released a guide on how to store images, which is going to be very useful for those of you who want to store things. And let's see, we have nice design things from Claire. The skeleton, which is very important. You will want to probably use a skeleton to start off your code. And it also has, I'll also have the office hours and hackathon links on the below. So I would read all of those if I were you. So read the pinned Piazza post. Cool. And tomorrow, you should come or watch the recording of the How to Deploy lecture, because you will need to do that by Tuesday. And it's something I would not save toward like at the last minute, like at 5 p.m., like you have an hour till it's due. It will probably take you a little longer than that if it's your first time deploying something, like a lot longer. I would probably try to deploy it the night before. You're probably going to run into issues because always happen. But yes, these are the reminders. I hope you're listening and you read that. If not, read the Piazza post. Cool. Okay. So now I will get started on TypeScript, which Palantir talked about briefly in their sponsor lecture. And I am personally a big fan of TypeScript. So is Johan. So is Buka Buka. So I'm very excited to talk about it. Cool. So brief overview of what TypeScript is again. It's a kind of a language built on top of TypeScript by Microsoft that enforces strict typing. If you've coded in Java or C++ before, you'll be familiar with what strict typing is. And it validates that your code works at compile time, which is good because you can catch the bugs there before it makes it onto your website. You can see it's kind of just a wrapper around JavaScript. And it will save your life when debugging. I'll show you why. There's a lot of good things about it, and I cannot recommend this language enough. Okay. So TypeScript works with all the primitive types that you've seen in JavaScript. So things like a string, booleans, numbers, and arrays, those things can all be used in TypeScript. And the syntax goes kind of like this. You create a variable, and then before you assign it, you add a colon to the end of your variable name or function name, and you tell it exactly what type it is. So in this case, I set message to the type string and set it to be hello world. So that way, this lets me know that I cannot assign message to anything other that is a string. You can see here, there's an angry red line. It's very angry at me because I tried to reassign message to the value 1. And if I hover over it in VS Code or I try to compile this, this error will show up in my console. It says type number is not assignable to type string. So you might think this is silly. They're like, I'm never going to reassign my code. I write clean code all the time. But this is very useful if you have a lot of data flowing through your application, and you're working with a team. So and your team members don't have a good idea of what the data looks like or what they're passing through, and they're working on it together with you. So it's good for documentation as well. So other types is an array. So you can also tell it what the elements in the array should be. So in this case, I have an array of strings. I have the string 1, 2, and 3. You can even do more with this. You can use your custom types later, which I'll talk about. Another thing that makes TypeScript cool is enums. You can't do this in vanilla JavaScript. You would have to make a class for it and stuff. But this is one of the built-ins of TypeScript. You can create an enum, and then the syntax here is you open it with a curly bracket, and then you list the properties of the enum. So if I want to assign this variable to one of the values in the enum, I would do color dot, and you can see here that it has nicely given me hints as to which colors I can use. So if I tried to do color dot purple, it would not work. It would not compile, and it would throw errors in your console because purple is not defined in the enum above. So this is good if you have custom variables in your code. I would make enum. Oh, and this is the most powerful part of TypeScript is making your own custom types, because you're probably going to have more complicated data than just a string or a number flowing through your application. So things TypeScript can do is something called an interface. An interface is something you can define in TypeScript that defines an object shape, which is kind of like a dictionary in Python, if you remember, but it can tell you exactly what properties does your object have, what values should the types of this object be, and yada yada. You can also have literal types, which I'll go over, and you can also type your function. So you can tell your function what parameter type should this be and what should it output. Yeah. So let's go over interfaces first. Sorry, this is kind of blurry. Hopefully you got the idea. But what you want to do when you create an interface, the syntax looks kind of like this. You use the keyword interface and you define the name of the interface. In this case, it's user. Kind of like upper camel case here. That's kind of the naming convention we're going to use. You open the bracket, and then you tell it what kind of properties it has. So this user is going to have an ID field, but it's going to be named exactly _ID. Nothing more, nothing less. It has to be this, and it needs to have a type string. It'll also have a name field, and that's also string type. And what's cool is you can have optional parameters or optional properties. So in here, we have something called is_admin. You do a question mark here, and to say, right before the colon, to say that this is optional. And then you call this a Boolean. Also, I know I just said to use upper camel case. I think I was bad and forgot. So don't be like me. Okay. So to use your custom interface, same thing. Remember how before we did let message : string? You can do the same thing here, but you can call it the user here. Okay, yeah. So this user here, and then I provided it the ID and the name, and there's no angry red underlines here because I followed the interface perfectly. And because isAdmin is not required, it's also okay with that. Cool. You can also use interfaces with other types. So let's say I defined a story interface earlier in my code, and I want to initialize a stories variable that has a list of stories. So what I can do here is I put the type of what the element in the array should be here. So I have story, and then I follow it with the square brackets to indicate that it's an array of stories. And then here you can see I open my array and I set it to be a list of stories. Very useful. I'm sure you have seen lots of stories in Catbook already. And sometimes you'll forget. You're like, oh, what properties does it have? Like, I didn't know it had a creator, name, component, and such. Another thing you can do, which is very cool, is extending interfaces. So in this very simple example here, I have defined an interface called shape. And I'm giving the shape a color of either blue or green or red. This line here is just it's like an or, think of it as an or statement. So I've created two extra interfaces, circle and square, that extends a shape. So what extends does here, it means that this interface I'm defining, like the circle, will have all the properties of shape, as well as this extra in here that I've defined. So circle will have a radius, which is a number, and it will also still have the color field, and that will be required. Same thing for the square here. The square is different from a circle, right? It has a side length, not a radius, and set it to number, but it'll also have a color field. Okay. So that was interfaces. Now I'm going to talk about what literal types are. So you might have seen this here when I kind of did it here. For color, it can be blue, green, or red. You can create your own types that you can reuse throughout your app. So let's say I want to make a reusable React layout component. So if you remember Flexbox from our earlier lectures, you can create the flex directions can be either row or column. So if I made this a prop, I could just do like flex direction should be a string because row and column get strings, right? And in CSS, you pass in a string as a property, but that's not like specific enough. I want it to be either row or column because if I pass in like another property that's not row or column, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't work. So you can make it even more specific by creating a type, flex direction, and then you do row or column. Another thing you could do is a dice number. So I could have just done like dice number is number type and like ended it there, but you can make it more specific by saying it should be the values 1 or 2 or 3, 4, 5, or 6. And that can be very useful in your code as well. The next thing we're going to go over is typed functions. So I mentioned before, you can type the parameters and the output as well. So in this function here, get comments, it takes in an ID, which is a string. You can see here. Same syntax, you follow it with a colon, and the type it is a string. And then what you do here to type the output is you put the colon after you define the parameter. So outside of the parentheses, and then you follow up with what type it is. So here in this case, it is an array of comments. You can't see the interface comment that I've defined here, but just pretend it has been defined above before line 65. And I returned an empty array here, which is valid because it's just an empty array, it has nothing in it. It still works under a comment array. And here, you can also type your functions inside of props, like inside of interfaces. So in this case, I have underscore ID string, a creator name string, content add, and then I'm saying this function needs to take in, this component needs to take in a function called handle add, named exactly that. That takes in no parameters, so that's what this empty set parentheses is here. Denote the arrow here, and you say void. If I wanted to define a get comments property to define this function, and you would do get comments, colon, and then you put ID, colon, string, arrow to comment array. In the chat, it said, will it let you append non-comments? No, it won't. It will yell at you. That's what's good about TypeScript. So if you're trying to append something that doesn't look exactly like what the comment interface is, it will throw an error at compile time. What about a variable number of parameters? Okay, so yeah, if you have more than one parameter, what you kind of do is after this one, you just put a comma in as you would for a regular parameter, and then keep defining the parameter name, colon, type. So you can do this with a lot of, you can extend this. It also works a lot with built-in React events. So this might look a little scary to you guys. Like there's a lot of things here that a lot of new terms here, but this is not something I defined. So React.change event of this specific type, I did not make this. In fact, I just React, it's built into React. So if you remember on our handle change event, so on any input tag in React, it will pass in something called the event parameter that you guys asked about. And then there's things like event.target.value, event.target.checked, things like that. Well, I can type this event. I can say that this React is a change event of HTML input element. And how I knew it was exactly this React type, I hovered over the input field in my VS Code and it told me, or I can Google it because Googling is how you learn to code. So you can also use this with async functions, which is pretty useful. You'll notice like when you're debugging, if you just print in like an async function call, it might just say promise. So it's very like promise pending. It's not very descriptive, but you can type your async functions. So if get comments was actually a promise, you can literally say promise. This is a built-in. I do not need to define an interface or any type for promise. Just provided in the syntax. And I can tell you, like, once this promise resolved, what sort of data should I return? And I say, oh, an array of comments. And you can do that as well. Today I'll be showing you like a little demo of how to use it in React code, but you can use TypeScript in your server code or like anywhere there's JavaScript, it's like replaceable with TypeScript. And what's nice is you don't need to, like, if you decide to adopt TypeScript, you don't need to make every single file TypeScript file. So you can slowly integrate it into your code base, like if you're just changing over or you decided to make the switch. And what's nice about React, it works really well with defining like prop interfaces. If you've seen inside like of our catbook code, the way we define props for you is like in the comments with the @params things. And you can imagine like keeping that documentation up like might be a lot of work. So the things you can do is you can literally define the props it takes in, and any component that uses this React component, you need to pass in the props or it'll throw a compile time error. Whereas if we had just put it in the comments, like comments don't do anything in the code except document it for the developer. But like in this case, it will actually yell at you if you're passing in the wrong prop or you forgot to pass in a prop. So I'll show you guys how to do that as well. So here, I've defined an interface props. You don't have to name your props, but I think this is a great name to define what a props is. So kind of rule of thumb, if you're defining an interface or type for something, make sure you choose a good semantic name for it so that you, like future you or your teammates know exactly what this type's doing. I also defined one for state. So things here, what I did here was I said user can be a user object or it can be undefined. And then you pass in like cat happiness, which is a number. And how you integrate it into your React component is here. Remember before we extended the component and we didn't have this extra thing. But what you want to do here is you do the caret and then you do props, comma state. You must do it in this order. You need to put props first and then state, or it's gonna get confused. And then here we have like this.state equals user undefined, which is valid, cat happiness 0, which is also valid. So it will validate that every time you set the state or you change it to one of the properties that it matches this. So it's very useful. And every time you call the profile, you use the profile component and you don't pass in user ID, well, your code's not going to compile. So you need to fix that before you run the code. which is really nice. So in this example, if you remember Chatbook from Tuesday and Wednesday, Chatbook was pretty big. A lot of things were going on. Data was flying everywhere. Like it's pretty hard to keep it like all organized, but things we could do here is like you can create like a message thing that tells you that the sender is a user object. It's not like an ID. It's not a name, but it's the actual user object. So it's very helpful when I'm trying to read or understand code. And also like chat data here. We have messages, which is an array of messages I define here. And it also has a recipient, user, which is defined up here. And you can use this export keyword because I'm probably going to want to use it in a lot of other places. Like we created a ton of components just to make Chatbook work, like single message, these input things. And you're going to want to use it in other places and you export it. Very similar to how I export every React component on the bottom as like export default name of component. And that way I can use it in other places. Same idea for TypeScript. Just make sure you export it when you need to use it in another file. Okay. So this is not a workshop, but if you want to just like look at the code with me, you can like be in the catbook-react repo and get checkout to the TypeScript branch and then npm install. So I'll put that in the chat if you guys really want to have this version of your code on your laptop. But I will open it up in my VS Code. Cool. Awesome. Okay. Can you guys see this, or did I just share my Firefox window? Okay, I'm assuming you guys can see it. Okay, so I'm on the TypeScript branch right now, and let's take a look at something we saw in day 2, the profile component. So I'm here in profile, and you can see here, I do an interface props state, and I defined it like that. And you can see, so here, right, I do a set state, and I said like cat happiness equals to this dot state dot happiness. I hover over it, and it's so helpful. It tells me cat happiness is number because past me had defined that. I'm happy, and I add 1, so that compiles. We're happy, and if we look at our terminal, compiled successfully. Yay! Okay, so what if I'm being bad and I want to like add a string here? Let's make it like, oh, look. Oh, it's already angry. Type string is not assignable to type number, so it already knows. Let's say I'm rebellious. I want to make this compile. I press save. All right, let's look. It's compiling, and it failed to compile. So your catbook's not even going to load if you don't follow the own rules you set for itself. And it gave me the same error as I did when I hovered over it, but it says, TypeScript error, type string is not assignable to type number. Cool. And then if I bring it back. Okay. And now it's compiling. Now we're happy. So I think when the chat someone asked if I appended like a non-comment object, that would return like a similar error as well. Okay. This is cat happiness. Okay. So if we look at our feed component here, yada, 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 I just want to walk you through this. So we have our props here, which is a user ID and a string. And we have to pass in, and the state contains a list of story objects. And you see here that I actually defined story somewhere else. So if I think the hotkey for it is like command click, and then it'll bring you to the correct location where it is. I think on Windows it's probably control click. So this command click, and how helpful! We did export interface story, and we saw exactly where this is defined. Oh, okay. And then, so here, I made a GET request to our API endpoint, and then I said that story object, it returned story objects, which is a list of stories, which is exactly what we want. And here, I did this.state.stories.concat. I hover with stories, it still tells me it's a story array. and it would be very angry if I changed this to something else. But yeah. Another thing here, we have add new story, which is used. So we have a story object, which is a story, and then we can cat it here as well. Very cool. This is our feed. Okay. So now let's look at chatbook, which is pretty big. If you're messing with stuff. So I don't know about you, but when I was first doing the stock lecture, I got confused because I wasn't sure like what all chat was, right? Like we didn't have this typing, so I didn't know that all chat literally had the ID all chat and the name all chat. So when it was in the state here as like all chat, like I wasn't sure what the recipient was, and I needed to look up here to understand like, oh, okay, these recipient has to look something like this. But when I was converting Catbook to a TypeScript version, I defined a user interface for it, which is ID string. I set all chat to be that ID with the same ID and name. Define a message one, chat data, which you might have seen. And then in the state here, which looks a little complex, right? Because we have active users, which is a list of users. And then we have active chat, which is another like object that has the words recipient and messages. So what I could have done here is I could have made an interface called active chat and then just copied this out, but I think I was lazy and just did this. But it's basically telling me that we should have recipient, phone user, and message the messages. And look here, I'm typing my asynchronous call with the get thing. And wow, look at that. And if you don't type one of your parameters, it'll say any. I would recommend not using, like not explicitly ever setting any of your types to be any unless you're in the process of converting it over or you genuinely don't know how to make it compile otherwise. But don't use any bad. So this is Chatbook. It's probably a lot more readable because I have types here. Now we have navbar. So what's good about TypeScript is that I don't need to make a custom type for every single library that I decide to import, because most libraries will have like a types version that you can install and download. So as an example here, for example, because we use Google Auth, what I do is I imported these different types from the library. Like it just came installed, and a lot of libraries actually happen to do that now. So here in handle login, I can say that you must pass me a response that looks like this Google login response or this offline. And if you're like, oh, well, how did you know like to import Google login response or response offline? You can probably just, hover over this like on logout success, and it should tell you. Oh, there you go. So how I figured it out was before it just said this.props handle login was any. When I hovered over the onSuccess function, it says like Google login response. So I decided to import that from the library and set it. So super useful because libraries can be hard to understand if you don't know all the inner workings. You might not know what props that the library expects when you use a component. So I think typing that is great as well. Another one that I'll briefly go over because we're running out of time is new post input. So here we had a ton of like these handle change events, handle submit, that was like linked to a button or like an input field, like a controlled component. So you can hover over the input to see, oh, it takes an onChange, which is a React change event of an HTML input element. And it follows the same syntax. Look, it has a question mark because it's not required to pass in this prop. But what I can do here is I can create a function that looks exactly like what they expect. So it takes in the event. And then I can use things like event.target.value or things like that, like safely. Because like imagine if I made an input field and I forgot to make it a check mark, but there's a certain field called event.target.checked. But I didn't know that. It wouldn't yell at me, but it would yell at me if I had typed it. So same thing for handle submit. You can hover over a lot of these different functions or parameters to see exactly what it takes. And I think if you click into it, it'll look kind of scary. But you can look it up on like MDN to see exactly what things it's taking in. But yeah, so that was just a little taste of TypeScript. It's very powerful. You can do a lot more than I just taught you today. But we've also released like a TypeScript skeleton that you can use if you decide to use TypeScript and if you want to integrate it into your application. So you can start off with that too. But if you want to make something TypeScript, just make sure you use that the TypeScript skeleton. The regular one won't work because it's not installed there. And you make the endings TSX instead of JSX. That's the important part. And yeah, hope you guys enjoyed that. But the last minute, for anyone who came late or wasn't listening in the beginning, this is the reminder slide again. But I want to cover hackathon a lot. We're going to have all the staff there, so all 12 of us. And we're very eager to help you with your application. And I think we're going to try to consolidate Piazza posts into one, so it's easy to read. And yeah, come to lecture tomorrow because you'll need to learn how to deploy your app. Those are all my announcements. Nick, do you have anything?
I think that's it.
All right, y'all are free to go. We're almost done with web lab lectures. Only one more day. Good work, everyone.